Hello, everyone, and welcome to African American Political Thought Lecture. This lecture is just going to be an overview. We're not going to go into the real nuts and bolts of African American political thought. There are two subsequent lectures that essentially are divided into two parts, from essentially 1915 to the present, and then from 1915 upwards into the antebellum era before the Civil War. So those lectures will cover that, but what we'll do here is just sketch out some very important ideas to kind of give you the foundation by which, when you get to African American political thought, when you start looking into it in much more detail, the foundation will have already been laid out for you. So I'm going to go ahead and key up the video. Now, the areas of focus is, one, we're going to be looking at the results of Reconstruction. So what we have in the United States is slavery is a major labor system in the United States, and it is deemed incompatible with the free labor system that we have in the United States. And what we mean by free labor is essentially you are free to come and go with your employer. There are no contracts, no indentured servitude. It's not slavery. The employer is free to hire you, to fire you. You are at will. Now, that form of labor was dominant in the North. Now, there were some areas in the North, like in Delaware, where slavery was an established institution. But for the most part, slavery was outlawed from state to state in most areas of the North. But it was the dominant form of labor system in the South. Now, not only was it a dominant form of labor system, but large and vast sums of wealth went into the slaves themselves. So the purchasing of slaves, the maintenance of slaves, the insurance for the slaves, the surveillance, or what I would say the police forces that were developed out of maintaining slavery, all had to be paid for. And so the entire Southern fabric itself, its very foundation, was then built around slavery. The North viewed this as being unethical, immoral, and incompatible with the form of Republican government that the founders had entrusted the people who were living at the time period to have. So from their perspective in the North, they saw that Southerners were in many ways out of step with the Republican idea. And there is a lecture on Republicanism that, if you're wanting to know what that is, I talk about that in greater detail. But nevertheless, what we have here is a civil war that takes place from 1861 to 1865, whose sole purpose was to destroy what they called the slave power. The slave power was, in essence, politicians from the South who largely dominated American politics because of the way the Electoral College was set up. The Electoral College was set up with the idea that you could count the population to give you more electoral votes. We have the 3/5 compromise in the U.S. Constitution, where you count 3 out of every 5 slaves, giving more representation to the Southern states than they would have had otherwise. So in large part, the war was going to radically shift and alter the politics, not only of the South, but of the entire United States. So after the war, the entire South was in ruins. You also had the emancipation of 4 million black people. So you had two primary goals here. One is to reconstruct, to put the South back together again from its complete obliteration by the North militarily. And then you had the desire by individuals in the North to give African Americans their rights as U.S. citizens. So this meant that they had to amend the U.S. Constitution to do so, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. You're also going to see the rise of black political leadership for the first time in American history. Now, the slave economy was in absolute ruins, and this is largely due to the system of agriculture that was being run in the South. It was largely a plantation economy. So in the South, you had tobacco, rice, at some point indigo, and cotton. Cotton was the main cash crop. These cash crops were, in essence, the backbone of the plantation system. So you would have these large plantations that were literally manufacturing agriculturally this cash crop that would in turn be taken to market. The North, on the other hand, was largely industrial. Now, this doesn't mean to say that the North wasn't or didn't play a substantial or significant role in the plantation economy in the South, because they did. The way this system worked, and I'll use cotton as an example, is that slaves were procured to grow and pick cotton. That cotton then was shipped to northern factories, turned into whole cloth. That cloth then was shipped to England, and that cloth then was turned into finished products to be sold around the world. So the South got rich, the North got rich, and Europe got rich. They in turn used that money in their quest to dominate the world. That's why large portions of the world speak English. That's why the United States and Europe has hegemony over the world in terms of its economic prowess through slavery. It is exactly what made Americans wealthy. Not only this, but after the Civil War, the United States, or the North, was superior militarily. They destroyed the Confederate Army. So not only did you have hegemony in terms of your industrial power, because the North was untouched by the war, but you had a military occupation and domination of the South as well, and the institution of Northern-styled government in the South. The South was largely broken up into military districts, and they were controlled by military commanders for several purposes. One of them was to ensure blacks got their rights as adjudicated by Congress. Now, this is a very stylized painting of a plantation, and it's obvious here that there are just a couple of things that stand out to me to be very odd, but nevertheless, I put this painting up because it generally gives us a complete overview of what's going on here. Number one, you have slaves who were working in the cotton fields. And what you have here are minus children, young children, usually around the ages of about 7 or 8 years old, are probably going to be put into the plantations and to pick cotton themselves. But usually around from 0 to say 5 to 7 years, children didn't work, slave children didn't work on plantations, but they could do things like assist other workers carry water, that sort of thing. But the overall production here was cotton. The slaves probably were not dressed this well either. You have down in the foreground the plantation owner and the plantation owner's wife. In the background, you have a man sitting on a horse who was either the overseer. In this case, the person looks black, so it was probably the driver, the assistant to the overseer. You also have what we would call the big house, where that long sort of chimney is stacked up, and there's a house in the back of that. That red chimney could have signified a number of things, a kiln or smokehouse, But in essence, most of the food on plantations wasn't cooked in the master's homes. They usually had a kitchen that was a separate building that was attached next to the big house. And the reason why they did that is because if there was a fire inside the kitchen, it would destroy the master's house. So it tended to be in its separate building. What couple of things that we don't see here, I guess we're getting a little bit of a hint of it towards the right in the background. The slave cabins, which were largely atrocious. They were drafty, no windows typically. Most of them did not have chimneys for heat, and during the winters, hot in the summers, there were typically no floors, no beds. Slaves basically slept on the ground, and they used basically rags as pillows. They were breeders of disease, the cabins were. The slaves themselves did not live in the cabins. They lived outside and they slept in the cabins. The cabins weren't there for you to, hang out and, sit and read a magazine or anything. They were just places to sleep that would provided you, when it was raining, a modicum of protection from the elements. That's it. In the far background, you see a steamship, and this probably would signify the Mississippi River. So the cotton then would be put on these wagons after it was baled, tightened up, and then they would be placed on these barges and sent up north and then transported to the factories in the north. So this, in essence, these plantations were fundamentally destroyed during the Civil War. The war cost an exceedingly amount of money, about $3.3 billion. That then in 1861 was an ungodly amount of money. Today, for the Iraq War, we probably spent about $1 billion per day. So for our purposes, it's not a lot of money, but back then it was a lot of money, where you would have been lucky to have seen in your lifetime, if you lived in 1861, a couple of dollars a month coming your way if you were an average farmer. So for an average farmer, $3.3 billion would have seen like an astronomical amount of money. By 1861, there were 835,000 Southerners, and by 1865, there were about 681,000 Southerners under Union control. Southern farms were in despair. There was lots of starvation. The South was in complete ruins. Now, to ensure black rights, Northerners enacted a series of civil rights laws, amendments to the Constitution, to ensure that black people would be treated fairly by white Southerners. The most important of these were the Black Amendments. The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution defined citizenship, and it defined citizenship by birthright and by naturalization. Why this is important is because in 1857, there was a court case called Dred Scott v. Sanford, where the U.S. Supreme Court basically said that black people were not citizens of the United States, and they had no rights that white people had to respect. So to correct this court case, the U.S. government established and wrote and had ratified in 1868 the 14th Amendment. Most of the slaves were born in the United States by the time this amendment was ratified. So therefore, They just decided that any person who was born in the United States would, in fact, be a citizen. Now, there's a lot of controversy with this amendment today because that falls into the purview of birthright citizenship, where you have the Republican Party who has been stating for years that they wanted to get rid of birthright citizenship because immigrants come to the United States, they have kids, and those kids are citizen, and then those kids, then there is some reciprocal rights, or at least there were some reciprocal rights for the families of citizens to come to the United States. This has largely been taken up by Asians. Asians are main beneficiaries of birthright citizenship in the United States. I, for one, think that this is an absolutely fundamentally good thing, that if you're born here, then you ought to be included as a citizen of the United States. I don't see what the problem is. But there is talk about ending birthright citizenship, and if they do that, that would be a fundamental shame, because we just kind of define the idea here in the United States, born here an American citizen. Now, this is far different than most countries of the world, where if you're born, let's say, in Germany, that doesn't qualify you for citizenship. Most countries of the world do not extend citizenship just because you were born there, but we do things a little bit differently in the United States based on the 14th Amendment. Now, the 15th Amendment then gave black males the right to vote, not women, but black males. Now, the thought process behind the 15th Amendment was that black soldiers had helped to defeat the Confederacy, and therefore black men should have the right to vote. It was kind of just on people's minds that it was unconscionable for you to be in the United States and not have a say in its politics. So you couldn't have people here who were citizens who therefore then didn't have the right to vote. That's why a lot of people have been arguing that felons, people who've ended up in prison, ought to have the right to vote because that's immoral, people argue. So the three black amendments are the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Now, out of this move towards giving black people the right to vote, we began to see a slew of black elected officials. This was a monumental push forward in the United States because these individuals then took their positions as duly elected and established leaders. Some of them were, in fact, former slaves. Some of them were free blacks who had never been enslaved. So after the Civil War, you had this huge monumental rush of black people being elected throughout the South in leadership positions. When Reconstruction ends, all of these gains will be completely wiped out. It will take the United States after 1877 generations for black leaders to assume roles, major roles, in the U.S. government. We're going to look at just two of these individuals, and the first one is Blanche K. Bruce. And why we're looking at him is because he's probably the most famous of these newly elected black leaders. Bruce was born a slave in Virginia and attended Oberlin College. Oberlin College is in Ohio, and it was one of the first colleges that actively sought out to educate black people. He was in the United States Senate, and he was a staunch advocate for the rights of Asians and Native Americans. Native Americans did not become citizens of the United States until the 20th century. So Blanche K. Bruce was one of the early pioneers of racial inclusion in the United States. And it seems rightly so, because what you have here is a person born in bondage who then is working to include as many other people as possible in the American fabric. The United States military was segregated. Black people were relegated to separate military units. They were almost completely pushed out of the Navy. But in the Army, they were used, but in segregated units. So one of the things that Blanche K. Bruce wanted to do was integrate the U.S. military. He was not successful, but he attempted to do so. The other is Pinckney, Benton, Pinchback, and he was different than Bruce in the fact that he was born free from Georgia. Now, if you notice his photograph here, you'll probably see and notice, first off, his hair, which will give you some indication that he was part white and part black. So he would be considered what we would call gens de couleur, gentlemen of color, people who had one foot in white society and one foot in black society. Now, when I say having one foot in white society, they were not accepted by white people, but they were in fact white because they were part, either their mother or their father were white. And so for a long period in American history, these people, sometimes they were called mulatto, or as I stated earlier, gens de couleur, gentlemen of color. They lived in separate communities and separate societies before segregation took hold. Many of them saw themselves as better than white people and better than black people because they argued that they had the best of both worlds. He was a Louisiana state senator, a lieutenant governor, a governor, and was elected to the United States Senate, but was refused his seat by white senators. So he never served in the U.S. Senate, even though he was duly elected from the state of Georgia. Now, as black people are gaining political power in the South, we begin to see a white backlash. Foremost was the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. This was a terrorist organization that was founded by former Confederate soldiers. From 1868 to 1876, the Klan murdered over 20,000 black people, lynching, shooting, stabbing, raping, burning at the stake. They also attacked Jews, Catholics, and Southerners who had come to the aid of black people. This was a formidable, and still is in many ways, terrorist organization. Their overall goal was to wrest power from black people and turn back non-white voters in the South. This was their goal. As black people gained the right to vote, the Klan and other groups like the Knights of the White Camellia, the Red Shirts, and other groups, their goal was to ensure that only white people were allowed to vote in the South. This is a drawing that illustrates the Klan's terror. Members of the Ku Klux Klan were members of the Democratic Party. The person that you see here holding the bag that says Ohio represents a carpetbagger. And why the term carpetbagger is, during this time period, people traveled with bags that many people said on the outside of them, they were highly decorated, they resembled carpets. So they called them carpet bags. And so when Northerners went down south to help black people build schools, train them, etc., they carried these carpetbags, so Southerners said, there goes a carpetbagger. Now, I have to say this about the Democratic Party. There were three principal parties before the Civil War started, just right before the Civil War started. There was the Whig Party, W-H-I-G, the Whig Party. This was made up of both anti-slavery and slavery elements. There was the Republican Party that was formed largely around Abraham Lincoln, and it comprised of several smaller parties, like, for example, members of the Liberty Party became Republicans. And then there was the Democratic Party. Wealthy plantation owners were members of the Whig Party. Average yeoman, poor white farmers were members of the Democratic Party. Northerners were members of the Republican Party. By the time the Civil War started, the Whig Party was destroyed because members of that party began to fight each other. The pro-slavery elements and the anti-slavery elements, or the abolitionists, could not stand being in the same political party together, so it fell apart. As the war ended, those former plantation owners, those Whigs, joined the Democratic Party. Now, black people in the South, who were or the North, joined the Republican Party. The Republican Party was the liberal party, and the Democratic Party was the conservative party. That's why black people joined the Republican Party, because they were pro-black. By the time we get to the 1950s, black people are demanding their rights. They are, over time, increasingly getting out of the Republican Party and joining the Democratic Party. Why are they joining the Democratic Party? They're largely doing this because of Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman. Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman made it a pledge to begin to push for civil rights for black people. And therefore, black people said, well, we're going to join a party that is pushing for civil rights. Well, then you're asking what happened to the Republican Party. The Republican Party, over time, began to retreat from black rights. The Republican Party did almost nothing to help black people as they were being lynched after Reconstruction ended. And I'm going to go through just a little bit of this and explain this with the Enforcement Acts. But by the time we get to the early 20th century, the Republican Party is not interested in black people any longer. Oh, they court black people and they want their votes, but they're not interested in doing anything to help them. So when Franklin Roosevelt, who was a Democrat from the North, he was from New York, and Harry Truman, who was from Missouri, when they took over the Democratic Party, they began to push for civil rights for black people. And so the racists, the Klan members in the Democratic Party, left the party and joined the Republican Party. The two parties switched people and ideologies. Okay, so this is why today the vast majority of all black people in the United States are Democrats. The Republican Party today is almost exclusively white. Now, you have a handful of black people, a handful of Latinos who are, and a smattering of Asians who are Republicans, but the vast majority of Latinos, Asians, African Americans, and other minorities are Democrats. Okay? Now, after the Civil War, because the Klan started to gain momentum, the Republican Party passed a series of laws called the Klan Acts or the Enforcement Acts, several of them in 1870 and 1871, specifically to try to destroy the Klan. It prohibited groups of people from banding together or to go in disguise with the intention of violating citizens' rights. So the Klan was, through intimidation, murder, lynching, trying to keep black people from registering to vote and voting. The Republican Party under Ulysses S. Grant, who was president after Johnson, was effective in destroying the Ku Klux Klan. However, this didn't stop violence against black people. It just eliminated the effectiveness of the Ku Klux Klan. This attempt to reconstruct the South came to an end in 1877 with the election of Republican Rutherford B. Hayes. We call this the Compromise of 1877. There was a dispute in the election between the Democrat, Tilden, the Republican, Hayes. A compromise between the Republicans and Democrats gave the presidency to Hayes with the promise that when he got into office, he would withdraw all of the military troops that had been sent to the South to protect black people. Once the military left the South, then the South could then disenfranchise black people wholesale. They stopped enforcing the Klan Acts, and the modern Klan rose again and destroyed black political life for the most part in the South. There were some gains for black people through Reconstruction. Schools were built. For a short period of time, black people voted, and there were economic possibilities. But Reconstruction ultimately failed because what people saw at the end of slavery was that racism reared its ugly head up in the United States. A lot of people believed that once slavery ended, racial issues would not be important. When slavery was the system in the South, there was racism because black people had to know what their place was, but it was obscured. And it was obscured from the fact that black people and white people in the South lived together, ate together, slept together. And what I mean by that is that think about this. If you went on a trip with your slave, and let's say that your trip was going to take you 2 days. So on the train, you had to sleep. Since you have a slave, where is your slave going to sleep? Your slave is going to sleep next to you. That's your slave. When you eat, your slave is going to sit next to you on that train seat, and you're going to share a sandwich together. So it had a tendency, slavery did, of obscuring racism. But once slavery ended and white people could no longer exploit their labor freely, although they still exploited their labor, but they couldn't do it under the same system that they had done before, they began to exclude black people from all sectors of life. Black people couldn't go to white schools. They couldn't eat at the same diners as white people. They couldn't go to the same facilities, attend the same schools. They were completely shut out, for the most part, of normal civil life in America. And this goes to a lot of other groups as well, Latinos, Asians as well. There were Asians who came to the United States and said, well, what school do we go to? And they would say, well, we're not black, so we're going to go to the white school because we're not black, because there's a black school. And they would be told, you're not white, you need to go to the black school. For their purposes, you're colored. Shut out completely of civil life in the United States. Racism, by the time we get into the 20th century, is an overt part of American life. The question is what to do about it. Now that you have racism just a part of life, you can't go to white schools in the South. You can't go into the same movie theaters as white people, or if you did, you had to sit in separate sections. You couldn't date anybody of the white race. You barely could even have anybody who was white, or if you were white and colored, as friends, because people would start to ask questions. If you were a white person and you wanted to invite some people over to your house to hang out and they were black, you couldn't do that. It was deemed inappropriate. So what are black people going to do about it? When we get to black political thought and we look at it specifically, there will be whole programs that will rise up that will deal with these kinds of questions. Two traditions sprung out following Reconstruction that would dominate black life for decades. The first one is the post-abolition political ideology that basically states that we need to fight racism at every corner. We cannot allow white people to dictate to black people whether or not they can engage in civil life in America. It has to be challenged and fought. Another side to that was community development and self-help. One ideology said, no, you know what? White people have all the power in America. They don't want us to vote, so let's just not vote. What we can do is build our own black communities and help ourselves. We don't need anything from white people, and we shouldn't look towards white people. Maybe in 100 years, we'll gain the right to vote, but today what we need to do is build up black America. And largely black people did that. They built towns, communities. You guys have heard of Tulsa, Oklahoma. If you haven't heard of Black Tulsa, you ought to Google this and look up Tulsa in 1921. Blacks built up the most prosperous black community in America in Tulsa. And whites were so jealous of black people that they completely destroyed the black community and murdered hundreds of black people and dumped them in graves. But nevertheless, community development and self-help were part of this. Now, out of this are going to come two important individuals, W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. Du Bois is largely on the idea of advancing the race through politics, and he will help create the NAACP. Booker T. Washington is not opposed to black political rights, but he says what ought to take preeminence in black America is helping themselves. Now, you have to understand why Booker T. Washington might have said this. After slavery, what are black people who had been on plantations all of their life going to do with themselves? They couldn't read. They couldn't write. They understood what money was, but if you went to an employer and the employer said, well, how much do you want per hour? What were you going to tell them? How would you know what a fair wage was? Black people, for the most part, had never slept in beds with sheets, didn't have the rudimentary, fundamental basics of understanding how to even sit at a dinner table. I mean, most of you probably right now went to a formal dinner, probably couldn't tell me the difference between a salad fork and a dinner fork. Some of you might, but someone has to literally show you that. It's not like you're born with this information. Someone literally has to tell you. So black people, once they're coming out of slavery, 4 million newly freed people, they don't know how to do just about anything but do the menial manual labor that they did on those plantations. So black people need to get educated. They need to build homes and communities. They need to be able to exist in a world that was rapidly advancing in its technology. So how are they going to learn all of this stuff? Someone is going to have to build colleges, professors, teachers. All of these people would have to be trained. Trained where? By whom? So this is a fundamental aspect of community development that Booker T. Washington and many of his followers are arguing this needs to be taken care of first before black people can even begin to think about voting. Some of the questions came out of this were, could blacks look to a future as equal citizens? Ask yourself this question now. Are black people equal to everybody else in terms of the law? Certainly, if we look at George Floyd, the answer to that is no. Blacks are disproportionately murdered by the police than any other group. Why is that? Was racism so bad? Or over time, would black people eventually be accepted? I certainly think that in many parts of the United States, people have just come to the sentiment, and I'm talking about white people here, have come to the sentiment that racism is just stupid. It's fundamentally, ideologically ignorant. It makes no sense. For one, nobody has a say in what color they come out. The vast majority of the people in the world are darker skinned people. So none of it makes any sense. Right? So we probably are getting to a point, especially with all the protests, the Black Lives Matter protests, and you've seen it where the scores of white people are in support of Black Lives Matter. So those young kids who are protesting all over America, the vast majority of them are young white kids who have tired of the racism. So we can say that things are changing, and they are changing for the better, but it's a struggle. Nothing is going to come to you without struggle. If you think that somebody is going to give you your freedom and your rights without a struggle, you're sorely mistaken. Some black people asked a very fundamental question: was there an alternative to living in the United States? Perhaps black people should just leave the U.S. and go to Africa or elsewhere. And lots of people have. Today in 2020, there is a movement among black people to just leave the United States and go to Africa. Ghana has been making significant inroads and trying to entice African Americans to come and invest in their country. My mother went to Ethiopia. I've spent a great deal of my life in Africa, all over. So for me, it's like a second home. This is becoming an alternative and attractive. And so people after Reconstruction, and they were seeing the violence perpetrated against black people, and you'll see this with Marcus Garvey's ideology, people were talking about the idea of flexible citizenship. We should be able to be Americans, but also at the same time citizens of Africa. And then the question is, how would black people achieve equality? How would this actually happen? Would it be through demonstration? Would it be through the vote? Would it be through economic power, as Booker T. Washington had articulated? These were just fundamental questions, right, that are vastly important that we will take a look at some of these issues as we move through the course. So that concludes our lecture here. If you have any questions about any of the material that we've gone over or covered here, please feel free to contact me.